Here we are talking about the curves assignment. And for the curves assignment, I'd like you to start with a file that has been uncorrected. This can be a raw file from a camera. It can be a large JPEG, or it can be a scan of a negative. What the very first thing in your workflow that you need to do for this assignment is attach metadata. So that will include keywords such as who, what, when, and where. Assign keywords either in Lightroom or in Bridge. To be honest, I prefer assigning keywords in Lightroom. And then also assign your personal metadata. So your personal metadata includes that which is called IPTC core metadata. So you are the creator. To make a copyright symbol is option G on a Mac. Your city, in case that you have an evil twin that lives in another city, you want to make sure that they're finding the correct evil twin in your city. Your country, and some kind of a contact information for you. And if you have more work on the web, even if it's on a social networking site, it's a good idea so that people can see more of what you do. Here we have keywords also in this area. Rather than putting them in the keywords group area, I can put keywords here too. Who, what, when, and where, including proper nouns and names of people. So this is Joshua Tree National Park. This was in the spring. It was a sunny day. Who, what, when, and where. This was a location scout. This was for SPE West, location scout, California. And anything else that you want to write into the keywords. There were cactus flowers and things like that, but I didn't capture that here. So make sure to put in, at the very least, keywords and your own personal metadata. And I'm going to apply those yes, because they will sit on my file. And I'm also going to, when I turn this in, the keywords and so forth stick to the CR2 file. So you don't need to worry about also turning in the XMP file. Ultimately, we're going to make prints of this. So the file is not as important, but archiving it is. The other thing, of course, that you want to do is make sure to label it and give it a color rating. And I tend to label it a select, that's a red label, if I'm going to bring it into Photoshop and do more work on it. To bring it into Photoshop, or rather into the Camera Raw processor, I can right-click on it and choose Open with Camera Raw. And you're just going to do the minimum adjustments in Camera Raw. Because we know that we're taking this image into Photoshop, I'm going to do all of my selective edits in Photoshop. I've chosen an image that lends itself well to Photoshop because it needs selective adjustments, such as this area here needs to be lightened, and I can also work with the back area. So in Camera Raw, you can make some basic adjustments in the basic panel here to the histogram. You might just do some highlight recovery, a little bit of contrast adjustments, that is making sure you don't have empty pixels on the left and the right. Okay, this is going to get converted to black and white, so I'm not going to worry about this presence panel here, just the basic panel. You don't need to make it perfect because we're going to make it perfect in Photoshop, but you should make sure that you're not clipping any of the important data, okay? It's okay if it's a little low contrast because we can fix that later. So you're going to do basic adjustments. I am also going to do some sharpening. Whenever I do sharpening, I like to zoom in to at least 67%, if not 100. And generally, I'm holding down the space bar so I can use the hand tool. You want to find the area where you think your focus was. And then if we do full-on sharpening, obviously this is too much. I can do a before and after here, just like in Lightroom. And how much sharpening do you apply? Well, it is a raw file. I need to apply sharpening. So I tend to apply around 50%, or oftentimes I'll leave these at the default. But I don't go crazy with sharpening in Camera Raw. I just do enough to demosaic the file. The other things you might do include enable a lens profile adjustment. That takes care of the distortion that the lens might have introduced. Okay. And the last thing that I might do is choose remove chromatic aberration. Chromatic aberration is anytime you see magenta or cyan outlines in an area of contrast. It's kind of hard to see right here, but you see that magenta line all the way around the rock, and you see that here it's gone. Okay, so that helped it a little bit. So I'm going to say, then I'm going to click on this tiny little link at the bottom, and we're going to edit in ProPhoto RGB, and I'm going to choose Open in Photoshop as Smart Object and say OK, and then say Done, and go back and say Open in Camera Raw. Yes. It should ask me if I want to open it now as a smart object. This is kind of a glitch. This happened before to us. This should say Open. So that's very strange. There we go. Open object. Okay. It should, whenever you click on that little link there, it should automatically say Open object. So now I'm going to evaluate the image to start working on it in Photoshop. But before I do that, you can go ahead and convert the image first to black and white. So let me bring my layers forward here. And I'm going to choose Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Black and White. I could choose to tint the image now if I wanted to by clicking on the Tint dialog box and choosing the tint color. But I don't do that because you see how strong it is. There's no real way for me to control the strength of this color. So I tend to do the tint using a color fill layer instead. So I don't even use the tint here. So here, of course, we can use the targeted adjustment tool. You can roll over into like the sky area if you want and work with the luminosity. Luminosity is how dark or how light a particular color gets. And I'm zooming in because as you start to tweak the luminosity a lot, you can sometimes see noise introduced in the channel or this kind of haloing effect here like we have on the rock. So I want to be careful. I want to zoom in when I do anything severe. And I can see this kind of weird haloing on the branch may not be desirable, so maybe I'll back off a little bit on darkening the sky. The rocks, I think, are going to be the yellow area. You can see when I click, it highlights over here. That means that this area is yellow. And you don't have to do a lot here in the adjusting black and white if you don't want to. You can just keep it on the default. Okay, so I've converted the image to black and white. The next thing I want to do is work with curves. So to work with, I'm going to put my curves underneath my black and white adjustment layer. That's just how I like to organize things. So knowing that my adjustment layer is going to go on top of the layer that I have currently active, I'm going to select this layer. Then I'm going to take my marquee tool and I'm going to make a selection. You can use any selection tool of your choice. It doesn't need to be accurate. So I'm going to use the SAM technique, SAM, select, adjust, and mask. So I've made a layer, I've made a selection. Now I'm going to use a curve. So the goal with this assignment is to make 2 adjustment curves potentially one that lightens and potentially one that darkens, although you don't have to do that. And looking at the curve here, this histogram shows me only my selection. It shows me only what I have selected here. This is my mask, only the white area. So I can see that in the foreground there's a lot of shadow information and a little tiny bit of highlight information. So I might just want to pop the highlight information. I might want to lighten everything a little bit by moving the highlight information to where the histogram starts. But I don't want things to get too light. I want the shadows to stay dark. So I'm going to anchor that. And I'm just going to lighten this just a little bit. Let's zoom in and take a look. And what's happening here is I'm getting the texture to pop out more. Here's the before, and here's the after. And you can see it's very slight. I might exaggerate it a little more. Okay, before, after. And of course, you can see where my selection took place. It doesn't look very good. So I've selected, I've made an adjustment, and now it's time to smooth out the mask. I'm going to click on the mask and feather it out. And in the case here where the mask potentially carried over into some areas where I don't want, there's a couple of ways I can fix that. The first is to paint. So I can click on the mask here. I can paint with either black or white. In this case, I'm going to paint with white. Or actually black to take away the mask from this area that maybe got a little too bright. Okay. And if I option click, you can see the mask. And that gradient right there is from the feathering of the mask. It gives it a smooth transition. If I double click on the mask, I get this feather. That's what a severe transition looks like. And we had it up at 24, which is a nice feathered transition, so that this this curve, which lightens the rock, looks seamless. Okay? Here's my before. Here's my after. Doesn't look like a big difference on the screen, but it'll be a big difference when we go to print it. To lighten the background, I can cheat. I can either make a new selection using one of my selection tools, or I can cheat and load this selection and then invert it. So I can if you hold down your command key, you get this selection icon, or you can choose select, load the selection right here. So I can either command click on the mask, or I can choose load the selection, and it'll say which one, the foreground mask, is correct. That's the name of this layer. So it gives me that foreground mask, and then I can invert it to select the sky. So that's kind of the lazy man's way to select the sky. And I'm going to shift click to get rid of that little guy there and circle it. Now that I have the sky selected, I can make a new layer adjustment, or I can modify the selection with the lasso tool. And I think I want to modify the selection. I want to get rid of some of the rocks. So the option key adds or takes away part of the selection. Notice that this is the area that's being selected, so it's taking away. So the option key takes away, and I'm just circling here. The shift key adds. So if I make a mistake, I can add back part of a selection. Okay. And now I'm ready to go, and I'm going to do select, new adjustment layer, curves. I'm going to call this sky darken, because I tried to darken it with the black and white channels, but it started to get funny looking up there in the twig area. So I'm going to just darken it a little bit in the curves instead. Go to my mask, feather it out. This one, I'll probably need a pretty big feather. And I might need to go in and paint a little bit with white to get it to smooth out. Okay, and I'm going to file save. So this is the very minimum you should do for the curves assignment on 2 images. One image can be black and white, just like this. It should have at least 2 adjustment curves. It should be a smart object. Smart objects are preferred because if you ever want to go back into the original and make any modifications, you can. Okay. And then the second image you do should have some kind of a tint on it. To add a tint, there's a few different ways we can do it. We can add a new fill layer solid color. We'll call this sepia. Or we can add a blue. Actually, I think I want sepia, that color, okay? And I need to move it to the top layer here. And then the blend mode needs to be in either multiply, overlay, they all look a little different, soft light, or color. And you can dial back the opacity to get the kind of effect that you want. And then file save. Okay, so that's one option. And this also has a layer mask on it. So what's kind of cool about that is if I want to remove just a little bit of tint from a certain area, I can. If I want to remove a little from the sky, I can do that by painting with black. Okay, I'll turn this one off and I'll show you another way to control color. We can also do a new fill layer gradient. And you can do a color to clear, which is this one, foreground to background. Right now white is my background, so I should have probably selected a more interesting color. Why don't I go ahead and do that? And it's not showing up right now, but I think but it will when I choose new fill layer gradient. The 2 layer, well, no, it didn't. Interesting. Well, I can also do one of these defaults. Again, in multiply, overlay. I'll just dial it back a little bit. Soft light or color. They all look a little different. So that's this one right here. You can change the direction of the gradient, although I have to say that most people just do a pretty straight up and down linear in a traditional landscape like this. You can reverse it if you want the blue to go on top. And I can also change the color if I want it to go from blue to clear. You see that? So right now I have blue to clear. And the next one I do can be new adjustment layer. I could do another one, another gradient. This time orange to clear. So you can kind of build out your own gradients if you want. So the same way, one is just a solid color. These are gradients. Okay. And then there are a few other recipes on the server, including one for split toning, where you use another curve and you go in the blue channel And I'm going to add a little blue in the shadows, just in the shadow quadrant. You see how we anchor down the rest here? Okay, and close that. That's our shadows, blue shadows. And that's in the blue channel only. Shows an awful lot of blue in the other areas too, except for those highlights. You see that? This image has a lot of shadow information. Layer, new adjustment layer, curves. This is going to be highlights, warm highlights. This is called a split tone. We're going to go back to blue, and the opposite of blue is yellow. So if we move this in the opposite way, we actually warm up the highlights, just the highlight quadrant up here. That's what we call a split tone. Okay? And just like the other layers, you can use blending modes with these layers. You can change them to color only. You can play with the opacity until you get a desired effect that you want to get. And file save. So just as a review, we started out with an image that we took from Bridge or Lightroom as a camera raw image. We keyworded it and added our personal metadata. We right-clicked on Lightroom and brought it in as a smart object, or we used camera raw. We then converted the image to black and white using a layer adjustment. And remember that this black and white adjustment layer has a mask where we can also, if we choose to reveal color, we can choose to reveal color, a little bit of color if we want to. Then we used curves to selectively lighten and darken or burn and dodge selective areas of the image. You can see this curve. This is curve lightens values, I think. No, this curve is darkening the sky. Okay. And this curve is lightening the foreground. And then we worked with some adding a layer, new adjustment layer, color fill, solid. We can double click on it if we change our mind about the color that we want, which is a nice way to do it. It's a very non-destructive way to do it. We can adjust both the blending mode and the opacity to control the effect. And then we also played with, instead of a solid layer, adding some gradients. And then we also played with doing a cross process in the individual blue channel, adding blue here to the shadows in one layer, and adding yellow, blue's opposite, in the highlights. And that's a review of the curves assignment. Make sure to check the website for some awesome student samples, and we'll get started.